Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 13th episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. This week on the podcast is all about the 16 days of action against gender-based violence, spanning across 16 days from 25th November to 10th December, which also encompasses World AIDS Day on the 1st of December and International Human Rights Day on the 10th of December. The 16 days of action were started by activists at the inaugural Women's Global Leadership Institute in 1991, and the campaign continues to be coordinated each year by the Centre for Women's Global Leadership. This year's theme is Orange the World, Generation Equality Stands Against Rape. This can feel like a big and taboo subject. Why are we talking about sexual and domestic violence in the workplace when it's not that common? Well, actually, in workplaces, it's vital that we focus on this. And often, the 16 days is a time to focus on domestic violence and how workplaces can recognise and support employees who are experiencing domestic and sexual abuse and what they can do about it. All businesses and workplace have a legal obligation to assess dynamic risk, as well as support the health and safety and wellness of all their employees. Organisations can train everyone to recognise the signs, support those who experience and who witness domestic and sexual violence, and create a culture where it's okay to talk about this subject. And here are some stats to put this topic into context. 1 in 4 women are affected by domestic violence during their adult lifetimes. 58% of women experiencing domestic or sexual abuse miss at least 3 days of work per month. 2% of all women will lose their jobs as a result of domestic and sexual violence. 5% of men experienced domestic violence in England and Wales last year. And 75% who experience domestic violence will be targeted at work. So this is absolutely imperative that we look at this in the workplace. And it's thought that the annual cost to companies is around $2 billion per year. Since 1991, 5,167 groups in 187 countries have contributed to promoting and supporting these 16 days. Each organisation, from large to small, will have approaches and will use the 16 days differently. One example includes the World Health Organization, who promotes 16 facts regarding domestic violence in order to educate the public on underreporting and misunderstood violation of human rights. So I couldn't just tackle this topic on my own, and I'm so delighted to welcome my very esteemed guest, Katie Russell, to today's show. And Katie and I worked together at Leeds University Union. We were together on the executive committee. And Katie Russell is a freelance writer, feminist activist, and national spokesperson for the charity Rape Crisis England and Wales. She's worked and volunteered in the rape crisis movement for the last 15 years. In 2008, she's an absolute star because she co-founded Support After Rape and Sexual Violence Leeds, or SARSville as it's known for short, where she remains an active trustee, and recently joined the board of Leeds-based charity Positive Action for Refugees and Asylum Seekers. As a specialist in sexual violence and abuse, Katie has been published in The Guardian, Telegraph, and The Pool, and appeared on BBC Breakfast, Women's Hour, and The Today programme, among others. She is currently also working on her first novel. Katie, I'm so delighted to have you on the show. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
And thanks for your patience with that long introduction as well. So, so over to you now. Can you tell our listeners about what the 16 days of action means to you?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I've really enjoyed and been passionate about being involved in the 16 days for the last 15 plus years, really, all the years that I've been a feminist activist. I think it's vitally important because it runs from the 25th of November, which is the United Nations Day for the elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls, through to the 10th of December, which, as you mentioned, is World Human Rights Day. And that's significant to me because it's a reminder that women and girls' rights are human rights. I think so often women and girls issues, violence against women and girls is considered somehow a niche thing or something for only women and girls to get involved with. And of course, the fact is that women and girls are humans and that their rights are human rights. And the fact fact that certain forms of violence are perpetrated against women and girls because of their gender, and that these forms of violence are being overwhelmingly perpetrated by men and boys. That's an issue for all of us, something that we should all be concerned about, that is to the detriment of all of our lives, families, communities, and indeed the economy. You mentioned, the financial impact of different forms of violence against women and girls, which is massive. So I really enjoy that it's a significant period of time, that it's symbolically bookended by those 2 dates, and that it's an opportunity to raise awareness, but also to celebrate activists who've gone before, those who've trailblazed in the name of equality, and those who've died, because violence against women and girls far too often ends in death. I've been doing this work, as you mentioned, for over 15 years. And in that time, the statistic that more than 2 women every single week in the UK alone are killed, murdered by a partner or former partner, that statistic hasn't changed. And that's alarming, and something that I think not enough people are aware of.
It is so shocking, isn't it? And rightly so, there's lots of campaigns about cancer, but why is this not talked about more? Why is there such a stigma?
I mean, I would say that patriarchy and misogyny play a massive part. I think, in the years that I've been working in the rape crisis movement, often for charities that provide services by women, for women and girls, so create women-only safe spaces for those who've experienced sexual violence and abuse and other forms of gender-based violence. In that time, I've constantly been challenged by people of all ages, genders, background, about why we provide services only for women and girls, and ask the question, why don't you provide services for men and boys? These forms of violence happen to them too. And of course they do, but I know plenty of people and work in close partnership with plenty of men who work for survivors charities that work only with male survivors of, say, sexual violence, sexual abuse, domestic violence. And they are never, ever asked the question, why don't you work with women and girls? And that tells me something huge, that it's not acceptable to do things by women, for women and girls, whereas it's considered perfectly all right to do things just for men. And both things actually are legitimate, because these are gendered crimes, and it's something we can't forget. And they are crimes that, as I say, are overwhelmingly perpetrated by men against women and children, which is not to undermine or in any way minimize the experience of those men and boys that go through these terrible crimes. But it's still significant to note that, because it's a reflection. Violence against women and girls as a form is both a cause and a consequence of gender inequality. The United Nations recognises that, and therefore, we need to be tackling all forms of gender inequality and speaking out against violence against women and girls as an equality, and indeed, as I say, as a human rights issue.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just, it's so true, and this is absolutely everyone's issue. This is not, it's over there and that's for someone else to deal with. Unfortunately, this is in the fabric of society, and we all have a responsibility to stand up and do something about it.
Completely, absolutely agree.
And could you just share with our listeners, Katie, as well, the difference in definitions when organisations, or when we talk about domestic violence and sexual violence?
Sure. So obviously there's some overlap, but domestic violence is usually refers to violence that happens either in intimate partner relationships or between family members in a domestic setting, usually in a setting where people live together. And domestic violence and abuse encompasses financial violence and abuse, coercive control, physical violence, emotional and psychological violence, and sexual violence. Whereas when we talk about sexual violence and abuse, obviously a lot of that does happen within a domestic violence context, in intimate partner relationships, between family members, absolutely. But we're also talking more widely about any unwanted sexual contact or sexual activity. So it doesn't just happen within domestic contexts. So we know that 90% of those who are raped or sexually abused do know their perpetrator before the event, but that could include colleagues, friends, dates. So quite often you hear the phrase date rape. It's not a legal category in any way, but it's usually used to refer to sexual violence that happens in a dating context, but you wouldn't necessarily refer to that as domestic violence because that's not necessarily an established intimate partner relationship. So, it's a Venn diagram, but it's not necessarily helpful to conflate the two because not all sexual violence is domestic violence and not all domestic violence is sexual violence. Although, arguably, if you are in a coercive, controlling relationship, it's any sexual activity that happens within a relationship in which you're living in fear, say, of physical violence or psychological abuse or financial abuse and so on. It's difficult to say whether sexual activity within that context could ever really be deemed to be fully consensual, because someone consents to sexual activity when they agree by choice and when they have the freedom and capacity to make that choice. And if you're being psychologically abused or threatened or coerced, if you're living in fear, then arguably you don't have that freedom to make a choice about consent to sex.
Yeah, absolutely. And the primary thing there is that you've got to keep yourself safe, and it means consenting when you don't want to, in order to preserve whatever's going on for you at that moment. I think that's often misunderstood as well.
Absolutely. So quite often you hear the phrase no means no in relation to rape and sexual violence, and that's really helpful on a certain level because we know that lots of perpetrators, lots of rapists don't listen to the word no. There's still a lot of, again, quite sexist myths about women saying no when they really mean yes because they're playing hard to get, etc., which is all obviously nonsense that you might hope we've moved beyond, but we do still hear those kinds of arguments. So no means no is a useful basic concept, but actually sometimes even yes means no in the context of sexual violence. And that I'm sure that some of your listeners will be outraged by that, but actually as I say, consent is when someone agrees by choice and has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. If you were standing at an ATM and someone came up behind you with a gun or a knife and said, give me your PIN number, and you gave them your PIN number, I think mostly people wouldn't have any problem understanding that you didn't genuinely consent to that person then taking all of your money, even though you did give them your PIN number. Likewise, when you say yes to sex, when you allow sexual activity to happen because you are frightened for your life, because you are in such a state of shock, fear, trauma that your body has actually frozen or flopped so that you physically can't move or you can't speak or make a sound. If someone has threatened your children, your family, your pets, etc., if someone has a weapon, obviously, and so you accept sex in those circumstances, that's still not you consenting. You are doing what you have to do for survival. And it's a big part of the work we do at Rape Crisis, to help survivors of that kind of sexual violence that's happened in those contexts to understand that just because they didn't fight back physically or shout out, or they let something happen because they were extremely fearful that if they didn't, for example, they might be physically very badly hurt or killed, or people they loved might be, that doesn't mean that they were even partly responsible for what happened to them, or that they consented, because there's a lot of shame and stigma and misunderstanding and self-blame and guilt that comes with an experience of sexual violence and abuse in our experience. So supporting women and girls and men and boys, anyone who's experienced this kind of thing, to understand that is a big part of what we do.
Oh, thanks, Katie. And just thinking about the private versus the public, and kind of the face that people have to put on in the workplace, which is quite a public space. how would you be able to recognize what might be some of the telltale signs? And I mentioned the statistics around missing work, but how would someone become aware as a colleague or a manager that someone might be experiencing domestic and or sexual violence?
I mean, that's an extremely difficult one, obviously, because everyone is very different and because people have such different strategies for coping and surviving when they're in that kind of situation. But some of the sort of coping strategies that people use, sometimes they involve substances. Sometimes, so someone might be taking drugs or drinking very heavily, or even smoking more heavily than they did before, perhaps controlling what they eat as a form of survival. They might be physically self-harming, cutting or burning, or they may just have become very withdrawn. They might be very quiet. They can be signs that might overlap with signs that someone's not doing very well in life or has something traumatic happening in their personal lives in general. They're not always necessarily really specific to sexual or domestic violence or abuse or very obvious. But I think the key thing, if you suspect that someone might be going through something like this, or if someone's behavior has just changed and it's unexplained to you, the key thing is to just make clear to the person without probing too much that you are there for them when they are ready to speak. And that can be a really difficult thing to do. But remembering that an experience of sexual or domestic violence can be extremely disempowering, can make someone feel that they don't have a lot of control over themselves or their lives. It's quite important to try not to be too pushy, but at the same time to not turn a blind eye and behave as if everything is normal when you know that it's not. So perhaps just approaching someone and saying, look, I don't want to, maybe even say, I don't want to be too pushy here. I don't want to, be too forward. If you think this is inappropriate, fine. But I've noticed that you don't seem yourself. And I just want to say, if there's anything on your mind, I'm here to listen. And, I won't push you into doing anything or making any decisions. I'm just here to listen. And when someone is ready, knowing that you're that person means that they may feel ready to approach you and talk to you about what's happening.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Katie. That's exactly the kind of information we give for other, mental ill health, which could be triggered by domestic and/or sexual violence. It could be any mental ill health condition. It could be self-harm. That yes, we notice that they're not okay, and we put that question out there, and we say, whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here to listen.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, and that's the thing. As I say. You mentioned at the beginning, people maybe think that sexual violence, domestic violence isn't something that happens a lot in the workplace, isn't something that affects everyone. But the truth is it absolutely is. Sadly, every single one of us knows someone who's experienced sexual violence, because 1 in 5 women aged 16 and over, this is according to the crime survey for England and Wales, not my own statistics, according to government-owned statistics, 1 in 5 women aged 16 and over in England and Wales alone has experienced some form of sexual assault in their adult lifetime. And that doesn't even take into account the huge numbers of people that we know experience sexual abuse in childhood, which is something even harder to quantify because so few people talk about it at the time, and often it takes many years for them to be able to reach out to someone for support. So, thinking about that statistic, every single one of us knows someone who's experienced sexual violence or some form of gender-based violence or domestic violence or abuse. So it absolutely is a topic for everyone. And the approach to it is very much the same, as you say, as the approach you would take to anyone who you thought might be just having a difficult time. Listen, don't judge, believe them. And this is the real crucial one, I think, with sexual violence in particular. Don't try to take over or make decisions for them or ask them why they didn't do X, Y, and Z, or why they're not doing A, B, and C, because we all think that we have an idea of how we might respond in certain situations or what we might do. And actually, until it happens to us, and even if it has happened to us, frankly, it's impossible for us to know how one individual will feel or want to respond, or just respond whether they want to or not to any specific event of sexual violence or abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think about the intersectionality part of it as well, because of course I was reading an article, and this might sound really obvious to you, Katie, but it hadn't quite dawned on me, around the different experiences of different generations. So there were some testimonials of women in their 80s who had experienced domestic violence. The focus was on domestic violence only. Throughout their lives, and then there was a testimony from one woman where her husband slept downstairs, and he had mobility issues, and she was still his carer, but she slept upstairs, and for the first time in her life she has finally got peace because she can sleep peacefully. She doesn't have him yelling at her, and actually that hadn't really dawned on me. And if you think about aging workforces and the kind of different experiences that people will have, and also, there'll be staff who are disabled, they might have a carer, they might not, but also who takes on the caring role for this individual. So what I'm trying to say is, in a family domestic context, someone might have a disability, they might not need a carer, but someone in the family context might think they need a carer, be that carer, and be a very abusive carer. And also we know about LGBTQIA communities, and the differences within that. And I think a lot of people overlook, in the case of same-sex relationship, that there can be domestic violence there as well.
Of course, absolutely. And, and I started by saying that this is domestic violence and sexual violence are very gendered crimes, and they certainly are. But at rape crisis centres, as at, I'm sure, women's aid charities and other specialist organisations that work around domestic and sexual violence and abuse, we absolutely accept each person as an individual, and listen to and take seriously and hear all of their experiences and their concerns and their feelings. And the reason, again, that might sound absolutely obvious to you, but the reason why it's quite important to reiterate that is because, in our experience, for example, those who have experienced violence in a same-sex relationship may feel that it may not be taken as seriously, particularly perhaps if their perpetrator was a woman. They may feel that they actually don't want to play into any kind of negative stereotypes that may already exist about any kind of community to which they belong. And again, that that can be an issue for people of certain ethnicities as well, because we know there's a huge amount of racism around the reporting of sexual and domestic violence, and some racist stereotyping of men from certain communities, South Asian communities, for example, or African Caribbean men being stereotyped as being somehow more violent or more sexually predatory. And actually, a survivor who has been abused in a community or by someone of a certain ethnicity may be reluctant to confirm that kind of stereotype, or may have experienced racism themselves when they've reached out for any other kind of service. So they may be extremely mistrustful of statutory services, for example, so unwilling to seek medical help. And we do work at rape crisis centres with a lot of people who have come to a rape crisis centre specifically because they are unable or don't want to reach out to statutory services because they've had really negative experiences of those in the past. So absolutely, the sort of barriers to accessing support are many and complex, and certainly, intersectionality is in the forefront of our minds when we're delivering services, because oppressions and disadvantage intersect.
Thank you, Katie. And then thinking about the workplace, then specifically, what do you think are so let's say we've got many workplaces who think they're listening to this and they're thinking, oh, yep, I can see that this is super important. I want to do something for the 16 days of action. What kinds of things do you think workplaces can do, should do? We'll start with can do to kind of raise awareness. And if this is their first time commemorating the 16 days, what are your tips around the things that they could do?
So, I mean, there are loads of possibilities, and you can think as creatively as you like. I think simply acknowledging and marking the days is a brilliant thing. I think linking up with your local specialist organisations and charities. Quite often they're very small, not particularly well resourced grassroots charities. They'll be really grateful to hear from you, to perhaps have some fundraising, some awareness raising around the work that they do. You might want to get one of those charities, a domestic or a sexual violence charity, in to deliver a talk or a workshop to do a bit of awareness raising around the issues. And again, thinking about intersectionality, there are some specialist agencies like Black Women's Refuges, for example, or specific agencies working with disabled people who've experienced abuse. So you may want to, reach out to them. It's not necessarily just the largest women's refuge in your area or the Rape Crisis Centre, although obviously I'd 100% advocate reaching out to them. So you can do training and awareness raising work, but you can also just do celebratory work. Think about researching some of the advocates and individuals in your area, and maybe having a display or some kind of celebratory event. The white ribbon has come to symbolise sort of anti-violence against women and girls sentiment, and particularly sort of men's involvement in and solidarity with violence against women and girls work, I think. So you could encourage people to wear the white ribbon or have a display around that, or perhaps have a day where everybody comes to work in a white outfit, or so there's a range of things you can do. A lot of people run their Reclaim the Night marches throughout during the 16 days. And Reclaim the Night, for those who don't know, is a movement rooted in the demonstrations of the women in Leeds, actually, around the time of the Peter Sutcliffe murders, when the police advice before he was caught, because he was murdering women, was for women to stay indoors after a certain time. So basically their response to a man being out on the street murdering women was to place a curfew on women. And a number of women activists responded to that by saying, this is a man, we know, murdering women. So if anyone should be under curfew, it should be men. And actually we want to reclaim the streets for ourselves. And they took to the streets and held the first candlelit Reclaim the Night march. And those marches have then been replicated around the country and indeed the world, and a lot of those take place during the 16 days. So you could organise your own or get involved with a local one. But really, I mean, I think getting your workforce involved and perhaps getting them to put forward ideas is always a really great way to ensure that these kinds of events aren't just tokenistic in the workplace.
Yeah, and that makes me think about staff networks. So for organisations that have staff networks, get all your staff networks involved. And I think, I love Reclaim the Night. As you know, we went on many Reclaim the Night marches, didn't we, Katie, together?
We certainly did.
And yes, I think they're incredibly powerful around solidarity. And it might not be possible for all workplaces, but I know there'll be ones in people's local areas as well. So how can you support them? How could you donate and make sure that there is one? Because often funding is a key issue to make sure that they go ahead.
Absolutely.
And just thinking then, so we've got the 16 days, but we've also there's been a bit more conversation. And I remember, with my colleague Kalpna at Imperial College writing a domestic violence policy. So we could get people who are experiencing any kind of domestic or sexual violence linking in with accommodation. And obviously it's different in universities because you have access to that. But your advice and your tips and your thoughts about how, if employers want to create a domestic violence policy, how it can really be embedded and go from a piece of paper to practice.
That's a brilliant question, and I think even having a policy to begin with is a really good start, because it signals an intention to take certain issues, out of silence and stigma and foreground them and tackle them, and that's brilliant. But you're right that policies alone, as we know, legislation alone, in fact, isn't enough to really ensure that these issues are properly tackled and that those who are experiencing these forms of violence feel properly supported. So I think, again, consultation is a great way to start perhaps by developing your policy, consultation with all your groups of staff and volunteers, if you use volunteers, and from the charity sector where volunteers and trustees would also be, among the stakeholders, but, you may want to talk about service users, customers, members, anyone who's involved in your organisation you could consult with. Likewise, going out to the specialist voluntary sector again, I'm going to repeat that because you may not know it because the charities in your area may not have the resource for lots of publicity and marketing, but there are almost certainly some grassroots community groups tackling these issues in your local area. So use their expertise, because a meaningful policy and set of procedures and guidelines will have, of course, lots of information about how to signpost those who are looking for support and need support to the specialist agencies that provide that support. So you're going to want their contact details anyway, but many organisations like a Rape Crisis Centre, for example, would be very happy, especially for a fee, because you should be properly remunerating charities who are donating this expertise, of course, would be very happy to consult with you on what should be involved in your policy and to provide training to sit alongside it or to properly embed the principles of it as well, if that's what you're looking for. Because the policy, I think, wants to absolutely address any kind of gender-based violence against women and girls, sexual violence and domestic violence against people of all genders that's happening within the workplace. But it also, would ideally be about general awareness raising to ultimately reduce those forms of violence. So around sort of healthy interactions and consent, like I mentioned earlier. And it would also talk about supporting those who may be victims and survivors of these kinds of violence, totally unrelated to work, but may have longer term health issues, for example, as a result of the violence that they've experienced, because you don't have to be currently experiencing sexual violence or domestic violence or abuse to feel the physical and mental health impacts, sadly, because we know that those forms of violence can have really long-term and often lifelong impacts for those who's experienced them. So it has to work in concert, obviously, with your other policies and procedures around equality and diversity, around mental health. But I think, again, sort of getting everyone involved is key, reviewing regularly, obviously, training alongside, and working with those local agencies.
Yeah, thank you. And it also really links into health and safety. And
of course.
yeah, which is so important for all organisations. You get audited, we've got a health and safety executive. So it doesn't have to be standalone either. It will link to other policies and practices. So why not just link it all together? And I think it just makes sense. So brilliant. Thank you, Katie. That's super, super helpful. And speaking about the work of local rape crisis centres and support agencies, how can anyone who's listening get involved with the work of Rape Crisis England and Wales, and of course Sarsville, the charity that you set up? What are your thoughts on that, and what kind of activities could people support Rape Crisis England and Wales and Sarsville in?
Well, thank you so much for asking, because both Rape Crisis England and Wales, even though it is a national umbrella body, and of course Support After Rape and Sexual Violence Leeds, or Sarsville, of which I'm a trustee and founder member, are really small charities. And I wish I had the statistic at my fingertip, and I don't. But the vast majority of our charity giving as a nation goes towards a very small percentage of the largest charities. And I'm not saying that those charities aren't worthy causes, but you're probably aware from quite recent media reports, as well as ones over several years, that some of the largest charities are actually very well resourced and have quite large charity reserves that they possibly shouldn't have accrued or are criticised for having accrued. Yeah. Whereas when you support a small local charity, which is much less likely to have received a lot of public donation or corporate sponsorship, for example, you can be really confident that your money is going to be going towards crucial things like service delivery, or rent to keep a roof over their heads, or volunteers' expenses, or paying salaries for key staff. So if you're looking to donate to charity, I would absolutely recommend a charity like your local rape crisis. Likewise, if you are someone who's a runner, enjoys sports or trekking or jumping out of aeroplanes or anything like this, those kinds of activities that are hobbies to you can very easily be made into fundraising opportunities. You can get sponsored on behalf of your local rape crisis centre or similar. And also, of course, as I've mentioned, volunteers a few times. A lot of local sexual and domestic violence charities, including rape crisis centres, do make a lot of use of volunteers. And you don't have to be someone who is able to support someone over a helpline, although many helplines, rape crisis helplines, are staffed solely or primarily by volunteers, as ours at Sarsville in Leeds is. But there are frontline volunteering opportunities like that for counsellors and helpline workers and others. But there are also lots of back office volunteering opportunities in a lot of organisations around administration, or indeed being a trustee, as I am, or fundraising and so on. So I'd really encourage you actually to search and get in touch with your local rape crisis centre. At Sarsville, we're at supportafterrapeleeds.org.uk, and there's lots of information on our site about the work that we do, the impact that makes for victims and survivors on their lives, because we receive a lot of fabulous feedback, and the ways that you can get involved. But if you're looking for a rape crisis centre near you and you're based elsewhere, you can go to rapecrisis.org.uk, which is the Rape Crisis England and Wales national website, and you can click on the Find Your Nearest Centre button, which is in the top right corner of the page and on every page of the site, to find your local rape crisis charity. And actually on that rape crisis website, there are also loads of really useful self-help resources for survivors, resources and support for people who are supporting survivors, for someone who may have just had a disclosure and is not quite sure how they can best support their colleague or friend or family member or partner who's just told them about sexual violence or abuse they've experienced recently or in the past. And there's lots of other sort of useful information on there about sexual violence, including statistics and so on. So if you're interested about the topic, I would 100% suggest that you go to either rapecrisis.org.uk or supportafterrapeleeds.org.uk as a starting point.
Thank you, Katie, and I'll pop all those links in the show notes so people can access them.
Wonderful, thank you.
And also don't forget, we can't avoid it. Christmas is coming up and it's become more and more commercial every year. Why not make an agreement with your family and friends to give a donation? And in fact, someone I know, she fundraised for her wedding and she gave all the money to her local rape crisis. So no shortage of ideas of how you can get involved. And actually, Katie knows that for a very brief time, I had oversight of a small rape crisis charity in the UK, and I was really shocked around the hand-to-mouth nature of it, and they absolutely do need your support, and they do vital, crucial work that isn't being done anywhere else. So I can't highlight that enough. And actually, just that we've got a massive role to play. All of us have a massive role to play. And I'm really pleased to say that the second part of this podcast, we're going to be talking to Harriet Smailes. She is a volunteer at a rape crisis centre. So if you want to know more, please stay tuned. We're going to talk to her and find out, what her experience is like and the kinds of things that you can get involved in. But I want to thank Katie so much at this point for all the information that you've given us, the context around domestic violence, sexual violence, intersectionality, what you can do, the ideas for workplaces, developing a policy. So please go away and do something for your 16 days of action. If you want to talk to me, my details as well around the cultural piece, but get in touch with your local rape crisis. And I wish you all a really positive and productive 16 days of action. And we'll see each other in the next episode, but do stay tuned to hear from Harriet Smailes. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much.
Right, so welcome to the second part of this really exciting episode for the 16 days of action around domestic and violence against women. And as I said in the first part when we were talking to Katie Russell, the second part we're going to be talking to Harriet Smailes, who's a volunteer at a rape crisis centre in the UK. So Harriet, welcome to the show, and I'd love it if you could introduce yourself to the listeners.
Hi everyone, my name's Harriet Smailes. I am a volunteer support worker at Leicester Rape Crisis, Jasmine House, and I also work full-time at the University of Leicester as a wellbeing case manager.
we're so delighted to have you on the show, because all the things we talked about with Katie really set the scene for this. So we talked about the workplace and the policies and the procedures and practices. And I just felt it was really important for people to know and understand more about what kinds of things people can do if they want to volunteer for a rape crisis centre. And actually, what made you get involved? Because obviously your day job is linked to this area of work. What made you get involved in terms of a volunteer as well?
So yeah, like you said, my day job is in a similar role in supporting students, particularly students affected by sexual violence and domestic violence. So a couple of reasons I wanted to get involved at Rape Crisis was to get a better and more broader understanding of the different ways in which this can manifest and how it can affect victim survivors, but also to be able to give back to a service that I refer students to a lot and get a better understanding of the workings of it, so I can kind of better inform the students that I'm sending there, and I can say confidently that I know the counsellors there and I know the staff team there, and everyone's there to work really hard and to support them. So it's just been able to give me a much better insight into that support network.
Yeah, brilliant. And what do you enjoy most about actually, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the kind of specific volunteering that you do and the other opportunities that are available.
Yeah, so I'm a volunteer support worker. The other volunteer roles are mainly volunteer counsellors, but my role as a support worker involves providing emotional support to clients. So I can offer usually up to 12 sessions of emotional support for clients that have either already had their counselling or might be waiting for the counselling, or might just want some support rather than getting some therapeutic counselling. And I'm also a helpline volunteer, and I can support with admin while I'm there as well. So if anyone calls the helpline while I'm there, I can support them over the phone. But I can also help with and do also help with general admin tasks that might be required, just to support the running of the centre as a whole. So that's my role. But the other roles in volunteering are, like I said, around the counselling roles, and that will be the majority of the volunteers that are working at Leicester Rape Crisis at the moment.
Brilliant. And of course, there's rape crisis centres around the UK. So those are broadly similar roles. But what I would say is, Harriet's given some great examples of what you can get involved in, but do check out your local rape crisis or sexual violence centre to see what they have available and how you can get involved.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so what are the best things about being a volunteer for you in this context?
So I used to volunteer at school quite a lot when I was younger, and there's just something quite special about the atmosphere of being a volunteer and being in a space where people are there to give their time for a incredibly special cause. And particularly at Rape Crisis, particularly at Jasmine House, you're doing something worthwhile, even if it's just answering the door or making someone a cup of tea, kind of welcoming someone in and contributing to a service which, in my opinion, shouldn't have to rely on volunteers, but it has a amazing group of people there to genuinely change the lives of clients, and you're at the grassroots of that. You're really making that difference. Like I said, even if you think your contribution is quite small and quite trivial, it's not to that person coming in and feeling supported.
Yeah, that's really lovely, isn't it? You're right, because when people make the decision to access help, it's actually a really big thing. So to have someone open the door and say, "Oh, here, how are you? Welcome. Take a seat. Would you like a hot drink? Would you like something to, read or whatever it is while you're waiting?" does make a huge difference, doesn't it? And you might think, well, actually, I don't feel like I'm doing very much, but you are having a huge impact on people's lives.
That's the thing, and anyone can do that. Anyone can smile at someone and make them a cup of tea and like you said, welcome them into a space which can be very daunting. We try and make it a really lovely kind of homely space, but at the same time they're there for a very particular reason and something that's going to have taken them probably a long time to get to that stage. So it's the small things that add up and really make a positive difference.
Yeah, and so never think that whole thing, isn't there? Never underestimate the positive impact that you can have, and I think that's a really beautiful example of that. And
Absolutely.
of course, as some people might not have much time, and the other opportunities are being a trustee for local rape crisis or sexual violence centres or
Yeah.
domestic violence charities as well. So again, if you're listening to this and thinking, I don't have time to do that on a regular basis, there will always be trustee positions, especially for professionals.
Yeah, and there might be remote ways to support as well. If you can support with web development or admin, things that you can do remotely from your home and kind of pick up as and when. I've also been able to support with the training of new volunteers, particularly new support workers, which I've been able to do just kind of in my spare time at home, just over email. So there are, like you said, there are other things to do. So it's always worth asking. All rape crises will be set up in a slightly different way. Some might be attached to their local sexual assault referral centre, which might provide additional volunteering posts as well. So like you say, just get in touch with them and ask the question, see what there is.
Fab. So if someone wants to volunteer, they've listened to this, hopefully, and your and Katie's, input into these podcast episodes. What would be your top tips for someone to find out more about getting involved in volunteering?
I think definitely getting in touch and having a chat, and maybe going to see if you can visit some of the staff or the counsellor or the volunteer counsellors or volunteer support workers that are there. Just talking it through, seeing if you can maybe do a bit of like a trial shift almost, just for you to see if that's the kind of space that you want to work in. I suppose it's really important to know your own limits when it comes to this, particularly around sexual violence. It can be a demanding role, even as just a volunteer role, and obviously it's quite a sensitive topic for anyone to be talking about and be in a space that focuses on that. So knowing your own limits and knowing what you can realistically provide that service is so important. So yeah, feel free to kind of get in contact with them, see if you can just try it out, do some admin support for the time being, and see how you get on.
Thank you, Harriet, because I think that's really helpful to think about the trial, because often people don't want to sign up because they're worried about managing their own expectations, whether they'll be able to, do it continuously. So that's a really good top tip, I think, especially around your boundaries and knowing your own limits.
Absolutely, and I think there should be a level of commitment to it, especially if you're going to be working with clients and doing that ongoing support work. So it's not to be underestimated, the commitment that it could take, but that's not to say that every role will look like that. So do really think about whether it's something that you can do, and then think about how much of that you're able to engage with. But yeah, it can be a sliding scale. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, like you say.
Perfect. And then if someone, people might be listening to this and thinking, actually, one thing, I didn't know whether you wanted to talk about sort of genuine occupational requirements, and that for a majority of rape crisis centres, it might be female-only volunteers. No, actually, if you wanted to pick up on that point.
Yeah, but again, like you said before, every centre will be different. There will be also, generally speaking, well, there is in Leicester anyway, there's a male-only service as well. So, depending on kind of what gender you identify as, there should be a service that would be able to take you on as a volunteer. Leicester Rape Crisis is female-only. But in terms of any qualifications, it can vary. Obviously, if you're going to be going into a volunteer counselling role, you'll be expected to at least be undertaking some training and qualifications for that. But for the role that I'm doing, I think all they want to see is a genuine commitment to this work and a desire to make a difference. And I think most people can pull on specific examples where they've maybe supported people in the past and really use that to show your skills in that area. But otherwise, it is a role that I think most people would be able to do quite well and flourish in. And there is training before you start the role, and there's opportunities to start off quite gently and maybe shadow some staff that are already working there potentially as well. So you won't be expected to just be dropped in at the deep end necessarily. So it's all good.
Great, thank you. And finally, just for the 16 days of action, what's the one thing you think everyone can do to raise awareness about domestic and sexual violence?
So I guess it's kind of a combination of lots of different things. But I've recently seen on Instagram from someone who is really active in the area of being a positive ally. Rachel Cargill has shared her understanding of the allyship equation, which is knowledge plus empathy plus action. So improving your knowledge around a certain area, being able to empathise with people going through their own struggles and taking action where you can, I think helps be an ally in any situation with anyone experiencing any form of discrimination or abuse. So learning about and debunking especially commonly held myths and misconceptions in this area, I think, is particularly important for sexual violence.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And yes, Rachel Cargill, I'll put her Instagram in the show notes, because I think that's a really helpful resource for everyone. Things that she does. And we talk about it a lot in our book group, actually.
Amazing.
So thank you so much, Harriet, for your insights. And I really hope that's inspired listeners to think about how they might want to get involved. Unfortunately, we are in a situation where, yes, I totally agree with you, Harriet. Why is everything staffed on volunteers? But we are where we are. So actually, we all need to kind of go in and make a contribution when we can. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we end this episode?
I think just support your local services where you can, in whatever way you can. Everyone can do something, I believe. So please do.
Thank you so much, Harriet. And if you want to connect with our guest, I will be sharing her Twitter link. So Harriet has a great Twitter, and she's too modest to say it herself, but she just last night won an award. So huge congratulations to her. We only have top guests on this show. So thank you, listeners. I really hope this has inspired you to take action over the 16 days. And do join me in the next episode, where I'll be talking about Christmas well-being and how to keep yourself well over the season. See you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.